Cool. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. And so just a little bit about Wellspring before we get started. So Wellspring is a human rights and social justice funder based in New York and DC. I'm based in the DC office. We fund both in the US and internationally. And a lot of the work that we do is focused on kind of movement building and ecosystem building. And that's kind of important for the context that we'll be talking about today. So what we're going to be covering today are two different use cases where we have seen the ability of large language models to help us kind of be able to do more with the data that we have. And this is all kind of within a monitoring and evaluation frame. I used to work in the learning and evaluation department. Monona has consulted in a lot of different learning and evaluation use cases. And kind of the overall North Star for our learning and evaluation and also kind of adjacent work in the foundation is that we're able to continuously adapt and sharpen our grant-making strategies through reflection and learning, and that reflection is informed by systematically collected data and evidence. The problem that we run into a lot, and kind of the main problem statement for what we're going to address today, is that the best data that we have about our grant making and about what it's doing is all kind of narrative and qualitative, and it's generally locked away in Word documents or PDFs. And so, yeah. And so we're basically drowning in this ocean of narrative information that, to this point, we really haven't been able to leverage and kind of bring to our program staff so that they can do the reflection analysis at the strategy level that they need to be doing. So the first use case that I'm going to talk about today is more of a lead-in into the main one that we're going to talk about, but it was the first thing that I started doing with LLMs, and so I'm going to cover it kind of briefly and just breeze through this use case. And so this was basically developing a grant classifier, and so every grant that we make at Wellspring, our program staff code it to the part of the strategy that it's meant to advance. They code it to the geographies that the work is happening in, the type of support, things like that. But we're pretty limited in terms of any other type of coding that we put on the grants. And therefore, we're limited to kind of interrogating our portfolios by what we've manually coded on the grants. So we saw a need to be more granular and also more flexible around how we're kind of classifying our grant making. So I saw the potential application of large language models to be able to help us do this. So the grant write-ups that we make to kind of justify the grants that we're making so that leadership approves them, they contain the strategies that the grant is using, the populations that the work is intended to benefit, kind of where that work sits within like a broader theory of change, topics, issue areas, tons of really rich information about the grant that we don't really have until now a way of extracting and being able to like report on in aggregate. So here's kind of a framework of the process that we set up. So our grant write-ups, they're Word documents kind of on the back end of our grants management system. So the first thing we had to do was extract all the text out of those. And we then kind of put back together the sections of the write-up that were relevant to the individual grant. And that's an important step because our write-ups also include organizational background, which talks about the work that the entire organization does. And when we want to get classifications at the grant level, I didn't want to include that organizational background that could confuse the model and talk about work that like the organization does broadly, but is not, this individual grant isn't focused on. So then we basically compile all of the text from our write-ups into essentially a CSV, a spreadsheet, and then we're looping that text for each grant, attaching a prompt to it, and running it through OpenAI's API. The prompt that we have on there is asking, just in plain English, questions about the grant and asking for an output in a format that is a lot more that's like structured JSON data. Then we're able to write those classifications into our internal databases and also into a tool called Notion that we've been using to get kind of a more bird's eye view of our grant making portfolios. And yeah, the loop basically gets an output from the OpenAI API, structures that into kind of a row of a table essentially, and then builds a database of each grant and all of the classifications onto that. So here's kind of a simplified version of the prompt that we're putting in. So it's asking about the focus populations, geography, strategies and approaches, topics and issue areas. I also wanted to see if it could pull out other grantees that are working with the grantee, kind of in a cohort or on similar work, and also if it could pull out peer funders. And that was a bit tricky because those are both organizations, and it had to be able to tell the difference between an organization that's like working with the grantee and an organization that's funding it. And that was, when it was able to do that, that was one of my first indicators that this is pretty good and that it might actually be able to do what we're hoping it can. And then here's just an example of one output. I know it's a little bit small, but the initial output from the model is in JSON, so we, in the prompt, specified that we wanted a JSON output and gave it an example of this schema, essentially. And so this is one output where it has, the strategies, the topics, and also I asked it to give a primary if there were multiple things that it could be, so that we had both all of the pieces of work that the grant touches on, but also one that is kind of the primary focus for each of these. So I think you'll talk about validation a little bit later. We haven't done a full validation process of this yet. We really need to in order to kind of bring it more into production. But the initial returns on it, I think were encouraging enough that we kind of felt confident that we could maybe perhaps repurpose this for other use cases as well, or try to do other applications with the same kind of workflow.
Apologies to this side of the room. I don't know why we're all the way over here. So I was hired as a consultant by just one program team at Wellspring to sharpen their system of monitoring, learning, and evaluation, and not concerning AI at all. That was in 2023. The SOGI team that I work with makes LGBTQ grants worldwide totaling about $40 million a year. They're one of the largest grant makers in this space and have been for 20 years. So my background is as a program officer and a director of impact and learning for various foundations and donor collaboratives. I've always been the resident in-house nerd who is trying to get the program team to sharpen their rigor and analysis of the in-house data. So when I first learned about LLMs just from the news, I was excited by its potential to address this near universal problem in philanthropy, which is that virtually all funders grossly underutilize the vast amount of grantee data that they have. At the same time, I realized that as good as AI has gotten, it can't really solve the data quality problem on the front end that Rich described, which is that most foundations have digital filing cabinets that are full of rich but unstructured data. And moreover, this data is kind of apples to oranges. It really can't be easily coded because people are doing different things for different purposes. And oftentimes the leadership is asking, well, what did our grant making accomplish, right? I mean, the ultimate question in philanthropy is, what change did I contribute to through my giving, right? And there's that bridge that you have to make between the program people who have gone out, met the people, seen the activities firsthand, kicked the tires, and then you've got leadership who haven't had the benefit of direct experience, and you have to make that certainty live in the minds of leadership. So the gold standard of qualitative analysis for many funders is to hire an outside evaluator. And that person will come in, look at a subset of your documents, they might interview some of your grantees and collect even more information. So this is a very costly and labor-intensive process. Having a functional in-house monitoring system is the holy grail, but it's extremely rare. The ones that I have built require very clear theories of change, standardized reporting forms and metrics, and an annual process whereby the staff analyze all of that data into a master grantee impact grid. That too is very costly and labor-intensive. So I was thinking, what if AI could help automate some of the most tedious parts of that process? The synthesis of all that data is really more art than science. The evaluator has to code hundreds of pages of documents, build a coding tree, et cetera. I think most of you are familiar. So at Wellspring, I set up a pilot project this summer to tackle the front end part of the challenge, which was getting and analyzing better data from the grantees. The nonprofits that I'm most familiar with in my work are basically trying to create some kind of positive social change in, community level, could be regional level, state level, national, through organizing, advocacy, civic engagement, coalition building, et cetera. Typically, they report on their activities rather than their outcomes, i.e., how did those activities contribute to changes in conditions for the individuals or the communities in question? And really, to be fair, it is a very costly and labor-intensive process to investigate these outcomes. So oftentimes the grantees just don't have the resources to go out and find out what their ultimate impact has been. During the COVID pandemic, many foundations relaxed their reporting requirements, including Wellspring. My team's grantees could opt for Zoom conversations instead of submitting formal written reports. So from my work with evaluators, I knew that interviews are one of the best ways to nudge grantees toward thinking more in terms of outcomes, because it's a dialogue. And I engaged the program team to co-create a script that would have a number of questions grouped in 3 big buckets. So number 1, externally, what are the 1 or 2 things you are proudest of accomplishing this year? So that would be sort of most significant change. 2, internally, what area of organizational capacity did you work to change and why? And oftentimes leadership wants to know what's the relationship between the organization's capacity and their ability to make external change. And 3, what have been the biggest lessons you have learned about what it takes to build power and influence over time? This is related to the power building framework that a lot of you are familiar with. We know that there are wins and losses. There's a cyclic nature to social change. And you can learn a lot from things that don't work out the way you intended, but grantees are really loath to report on that because they think it'll hurt their renewal chances. So we wanted to create more intentional safety around, tell us what you've learned regardless of whether you learned it from, progress or setback. So what I wanted to do was to get the program officers on board quickly, right? They had to understand how this was going to benefit them, because no matter how good your tool is, it's only as good as people are willing to use it. And they bought into this because they too wanted to, they were feeling pressure to report in a more outcome-oriented way to their leadership. So over the course of the summer, the program officers used the script that they had helped develop and conducted a total of 10 online interviews. These were then audio recorded and transcribed. So I went through over 100 pages of transcripts. I proofed them against the audio, and then I manually coded them as if I were an evaluator, highlighting the key themes and examples. And at that point, I was really eager to experiment with some kind of AI-enabled tool, but I didn't have one that would meet the foundation's security standards. Imagine my surprise in early September when I learned that Rich had already built, this classifier with ChatGPT. So my first thought was, well, why am I even bothering with qualitative data analysis software when ChatGPT understands natural language? My second thought was, I wonder if Rich wants to work together. So fortunately, we already had a relationship. We had met in 2018 when I was Director of Impact and Learning at Borealis Philanthropy. And I just went down to Wellspring to sit at their table and hear what they were up to. So we had mutual respect, we had a good communication, and we had in fact been working on the same kinds of problems in the same institution. So, bam, as soon as we saw that each had what the other needed, he had the technical expertise and access to the tool. I had the program expertise, but crucially, I also had mandated engagement from the program team. And this is important. My program director was fully on board, and she wanted to make progress, and she empowered me with both carrots and sticks to do that. So our synergy quickly produced results. Rich's prompt engineering was already so good that it was virtually plug and play when he applied it to the interview transcripts. And we were able to demo the results in 2 days for the staff. One of the analogies I made to them was that Rich had built a tool that was to their own in-house grantee data as a browser is to the internet, right? So constantly we're dealing with humans that are not like super technical, and we have to make analogies like, why is this going to help you? What task is it going to solve? Let's see. After Rich demoed the initial outputs, the program staff immediately grasped what was possible with the tool, and they were very enthusiastic about continuing the pilot and providing us with the feedback to improve the prompts, because we wanted to iterate. We wanted to act like a product development team and take inputs from the end users and keep rolling out more versions. So I want to underscore that that's the true leverage of this moment. Everybody who works in your foundation understands something big is happening in AI, even if they're not engaged with it. It's that sort of ambient understanding of how important this breakthrough is and how it might affect their work that is motivating program people to be open and focused on working with technical people. And that's the power of this moment.
Great. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about how we kind of adapted that initial grant classifier to this use case that Monona was talking about with the SOGI program. And really the main goal of what we were trying to do is extract out individual achievements, accomplishments, outcomes, and then also extract out challenges, learnings, adaptations that grantees are making in their work. So we really wanted to be able to kind of extract those out as individual items from either the interview transcript, from grantee reports that our grantees had submitted using our standard reporting form, or also another piece of our COVID more flexible reporting guidelines is that grantees could also submit a report that they had submitted to another funder in whatever format that was. And so from a knowledge management perspective and kind of, it was kind of a mess. We have like our reports that came in through our grants management system. We've got PDFs that are like uploaded to the like document storage in the grants management system. We have notes from calls that are in like whoever's OneNote or whatever other tool that they're using. And so kind of compiling the data set for reports was a lot more difficult than compiling the data set for the grant classifier using our grant write-ups, because those were all clean and in one place. So that was an initial challenge, was like extracting all of the text from like the PDFs and Word documents that were submitted as reports that had come from other funders, plus extracting out the individual fields that were kind of in a more tabular format from our grantee reporting form, and then also bringing in the interview transcripts from what Monona was talking about. We don't have a solution for the calls that staff did and just took notes wherever or didn't take notes. That would be like digging into everyone's personal filing systems. So we didn't go that far, but we were able to compile a pretty good data set of reporting information. And so from there, it was pretty much the same process. We just changed the prompt to ask it to be extracting those individual accomplishments and those individual learnings. We're still having it structure the output as a JSON and then put it into a data frame, but in this case, we were having it output 2 data frames, one for the accomplishments and learnings, accomplishments and achievements, and one for the learnings. So I have just a quick example of the output from this. So just as an Excel file. These are kind of the itemized accomplishments. It titles them, it gives the details of them, it gives implications, and then it's also performing a similar kind of classification as we were looking at in the initial classifier, but is doing it at the individual achievement level as opposed to for the grant overall. So you can get sort of more granular classifications of different pieces of the work instead of just for the grant overall this way. And then this is similarly, the learnings and insights table, where again, we've got the details, the implications, and some categorizations. And so big picture, what we were hoping this would be useful for is that during annual strategic reflection processes or biannual strategic reflection processes, instead of, and some of the questions that are on that reflection are just kind of, what progress are you making? What challenges have you encountered? What adaptations are you going to make to your strategy based on, challenges, developments, contextual things that have shifted? And we're hoping that this data set can help provide better and more comprehensive kind of building blocks for those strategy level reflections and analyses. So for example, because we have these categorized in different ways, we could look at shared challenges that grantees working on narrative change or advocacy work are encountering, filter this down, and then hopefully be able to more easily tell a story of like where, what commonalities are we seeing in the challenges that grantees working on that very specific type of work in, cross sections of our portfolios are encountering. Same with the achievements, hopefully those can ladder up to like strategy level achievements. As Monona was mentioning earlier, one thing that we found with this is that a lot of what it was pulling out was kind of activity and output language, and less so what is the change that the work you're doing is leading to. And so that, I think, is more of a limitation of the data that we're using as the source for this than the model itself. And one other word about that, I do have this implications column here, and I said in the prompt, like, don't put anything in there that is not mentioned directly in the source text, because I was worried that if thinking of like why this is important, it might kind of draw on other knowledge that it has, and I didn't want it to do that. I only wanted it to pick out what it saw in the source text. Also, the model temperature is at 0, so hopefully it wouldn't be creative or hallucinating. But I haven't validated that. Again, I don't know if this is if these implications are directly in the source text, or if it is kind of taking some liberty and thinking about like why this is important and coming up with its own justification. But yeah.
So you can see that we were using the AI to basically bring the tools of a human evaluator into the program team. And if we'd had the time, we would have, really done the meaning making with the team, looking at the collective outputs or outcomes in certain bands. I mean, that was the intention. Unfortunately, we demoed this on September 4th, and a couple of weeks later, the foundation announced that it was going to be winding down. So that was very unexpected for us. We were fortunate in that we had demoed it and gotten the initial enthusiasm of the program team. The next stage, we have lots of really interesting questions where Rich was going to crunch the primary outputs to get kind of cohort level or portfolio level findings that we could, again, sit in a room with people and try to figure out what does this all mean, because the contextual knowledge is in the brains of the program officers who've spent, some of them 14 years traveling the world, meeting with queer people all over the world to really understand the particular conditions in that country. Like that's the gold, right? And you want to connect these building blocks, which nobody can possibly hold in their head, no matter how good they are. We saw these as a way to facilitate much better reflection and meaning making by the humans in the loop. So I recommend this book. I don't know if if many of you have read it, Co-Intelligence by Ethan Mollick, but he talks about the jagged frontier of AI, which is that it's not a straight line what AI is good at and what humans are good at. In your particular job, the only way to learn is by doing. And that is where you find what AI is accurate at and trustable to delegate to, and then what should be held by humans. And ideally, what you're trying to come up with is a way to collaborate, not to delegate everything, but to collaborate as if the AI is another teammate with limitations. So what has been exciting, I think, for us is just that, just in this very brief pilot, we saw the massive curiosity and the power of the tool and how much it could change the culture of how program people relate to their own data. That's the key. If you change that, then you can change many other things. I have another sort of visual image in my head. Why did our collaboration work so well? It was fortuitous, right? So I think of it as kind of a bridge where you've got the humans over here. They're running around the world, meeting with organizers. They're passionately motivated by very high ideals, typically not super technical. Over here you've got the IT people, and you have to bridge this entire distance, but it's really not possible to bridge it with one person. So here's the program people. I sit here. I have been them, but I'm also very interested in data and how to get more out of it. Rich sits next to me, right, because he's immersed in the data architecture of his foundation, but he's also very conversant with program strategy. And sitting next to him are Python engineers that he's directing. And then finally, we have the whole IT infrastructure of the foundation. So because we had the relationship and we were kind of rowing in the same direction, when we joined forces, we could bridge this entire distance very quickly. And one of our takeaways, the first one, is that you've got to assemble the human and the technical expertise to bridge whatever distance you're trying to bridge. And you cannot ask one person to do it all.
The next and related to that is that we weren't trying to replace any sort of human analysis in this process. We were trying to really automate tasks that to this point have not really been possible because we have so much information. It's all so qualitative, and in an annual reflection process previously, it just wouldn't have been possible to go back and read 125-page reports from your grantees and try to base your analysis on that. So we're trying to bring the key kind of building blocks of information out of that ocean of narrative text to help facilitate the synthesis that our program staff are going to be doing. Monona had mentioned that we were going to experiment with kind of seeing if the AI could do kind of a second layer of analysis, like working from that output that I was showing a minute ago, seeing how well it could kind of summarize up across a cohort or across a cross-section of our portfolios. And maybe that would have worked if we, like she said, sat in a room and kind of really built the confidence that the output was good. But really at just a basic level, we wanted to provide better information, better data for the human reflection process.
And this is important. When you do communicate with your grantees about this, they have to understand that you're not delegating the reading of their carefully written reports to a machine. Their program officer is always going to read their reports. But what doesn't happen is that it gets fed into a larger meaning-making process. So this is an enhancement of their reporting. And finally, we all know garbage in, garbage out. You've got to get better quality data in order to use this super powerful tool. And that's another Oprah show, but it can be done, and that's really a human process.
Yeah, and building on that, it was really clear when we looked at the difference between the model output when we were running the transcripts from the interviews, where Monona had crafted like very specific questions and talking points in the interview guidelines that were touching on each of the things that we wanted the model to be able to extract. Versus when we were looking at, say, a report that a grantee had submitted for another funder, where we don't have any idea really like what the questions that led to that report were, and even our own reporting form, like those questions are maybe 10 years old and they're probably not best designed to feed into to gather the information that we want to be able to feed into our reflection processes. And so really the limiting factor here, like you still have to ask really good questions to get good source material for these models to be effective.
And
You mentioned this, yeah.
So thank you so much, Michelle and Lucia, for organizing this. We just have a little time for questions.
Yeah. And also, before we get there are 3 names on this slide. Raj is at the bottom. Raj was the primary engineer that built the Python scripts and kind of orchestration framework for all of this, and so I just wanted to thank him and give him credit here as well.
This was such a great presentation. Thank you very much. I'm Chris with the Annie Casey Foundation. Love to follow up on a lot of it, but just one narrow question for now while we're talking AI and capacity. I know there's been some caution on the part of like larger research firms, your MDRCs and Urbans, to use LLMs for classification and research and evaluation projects. Monona, you mentioned, I think, that you had sort of hand-coded at least 10 interviews and then went back and I think applied this classifier to them. Any insights about how effective that was, how accurate it was, how suitable it was?
With a rough scan, I felt like it was pretty darn good, shockingly good, and a zillion times faster. Again, if we hadn't sort of had this left turn with the overall foundation, we would have done a lot more validation. I wish I could give you a better answer, but all the source material's there. So you can validate in various ways using the team, ideally. I didn't want to do all the validation myself. I wanted that to be part of the engagement process.
Can I ask you to unshare your screen just in case anyone online has a question? And how many questions are in the room? So let's see if we can get 2 more in. We're running short on time. We'll go Paige and then David and then online too.
Great. Hi, I'm Paige Granger, Managing Director of Grants here at the Rockefeller. Wanting to get a sense from you, how long did it take for you to go from start to finish of getting the model to work and provide the data that was useful and impactful?
We started the development process of the classifier, I think, in March or April, and it was never, I wouldn't say it was ever sort of like a full-time, like primary focus project of my work, or even Raj, who was helping develop. We had a lot of other things on our plate as well. But I think March, April is when we started, and we had a working prototype probably over the summer. So,
really interesting presentation. Thank you. I'm David Coker. I'm a professor at Boston University. So we have a thing called the National Science Foundation, NRT, and it funds a whole bunch of graduate students. But it also is required we have to have an evaluator come in. And so this takes away from our ability to fund graduate students and develop the science around all this sort of stuff. Does this does this have the potential to replace that type of evaluation process? And moreover, how do you get it trusted by the leadership? If I had this in place and I didn't have to pay an evaluator, how would I convince my program officer at NSF that this was a good way to go?
Well, that's why we started with a pilot, because the whole process involves trust building and demoing along the way. So I don't think there's a shortcut. I think foundations are a relational business, right? I mean, we all understand that as much as foundations say they're driven by evidence, they're driven by relationships. And that's the art that has to happen between donors and grantees. It's just a longer answer. I'd be happy to talk to you later.
And on the replacing evaluators, that's a sticky question. But I think in general, we view this as a tool to enhance decision making and not really replace it. So in our use case, it was really about providing better data and evidence for that human
For an
evaluator,
in-house, yeah.
yeah, rather than kind of getting rid of them and doing it instead. So.
I think we're at, was there any other super quick questions before we, okay.
Thank you for sharing. Chigozio Korea and the EKC Foundation. You did mention something about the security. The security wasn't up to par. Could you talk more about that? And also, do you feel like your model will get better as time goes on, as it learns the data and you keep going? I guess the answer is yes. But could you talk about the security part?
Yeah, so on the security piece, some of the tools that we were looking into, Coloop was one of them. And then also just kind of the free versions of every other tool, like those wouldn't. So with Coloop specifically and some of the other qualitative data analysis tools we looked into, they didn't have a SOC 2. And so that was a no-go for our IT department. And all of the free tools we can't use because they might use the data to train on, it might show up in a future release of the model. So those were also a no-go. What we're using now is the OpenAI API that is behind Azure. And so that slightly complicates how you connect to it, but because it's via Azure, it's then subject to our overall service level agreement with Microsoft. And so the same kind of data protections that we have for OneDrive or for anything else, like that applies to the data that's going into the OpenAI model. On the second, sorry, what was the second question?
Training
Oh,
question.
training question. I don't think this will get better over time because it's in a loop, and so like each new piece of text with a prompt that we're submitting to it is essentially in a vacuum, and so I don't think it's learning over time, and we're not using, like with the API, we don't have any sort of like memory enabled that you would get kind of in like ChatGPT Enterprise, and so I could be wrong here, but I don't think that it will get better over time. We can make it better over time by improving the prompt and kind of seeing where the output isn't what we want it to, and then maybe providing some more examples or getting more specific about what we're looking for in the prompt. But by itself, I don't think it's learning.
Thank you very, very much. That was great. And we'll direct any other follow-up questions to you through email. Thank you very much.